Signal Zero by Charlie Follett. A short story set at the dawn of the integration era. The universe introduced itself on a Thursday, which was slightly better than a Tuesday, but still not great. I'd been standing guard outside a hole in the ground for 11 weeks, 3 days, and about 6 hours by my internal clock. And in that time, the most dangerous thing I'd encountered was a protein bar that tasted like cardboard soaked in regret. The excavation team called Cantos 4, a significant archaeological site. I called it a rock with ambitions. The wind was wrong here, not strong enough to be impressive, just present enough to be annoying, carrying grit that found its way into everything regardless of seals and filters and the 17 layers of complaints I'd submitted to the survey coordinator. I was a sergeant in the Helix Colonial Survey's Security Division. 22 years in, if you counted the 3 years before I transferred laterally from the Markov Protectorate's mobile infantry. My assignment, keep the eggheads alive long enough to do their work. Simple, achievable, profoundly boring. In my job, boring was good. The site on Cantos 4 wasn't like the other architect ruins scattered across the frontier. I'd seen 3 before this one. A crumbled spire on VEF -9 that turned out to be load-bearing nothing. A subsurface chamber on Delos Station that the xenoarchaeologists argued about for 6 years before concluding it was inconclusive. This one was different in ways that made me want to stand between it and the exit. The geometry was intact, not worn down, not eroded, just waiting. The angles of the stone were too consistent. The material absorbed light in a way that made your eyes want to slide off it. The survey team's lead archaeologist, Dr. Cassie Orrell, had called it the most perfectly preserved architect installation ever catalogued, with the breathless joy of someone announcing good news, rather than pointing at a grenade with the pin still in it. I'd been saying we shouldn't touch anything for 11 weeks. I'd been overruled every time. On the 79th day, they found the inner chamber. Orrell came to get me herself, which was unusual. She was a compact woman, with the focused energy of someone who operated at a permanently higher metabolic rate than the rest of humanity, and she'd spent most of our acquaintance treating me as a necessary inconvenience, the way you might treat a fire extinguisher in a room that's never caught fire. But she came to my post at the site perimeter with something new on her face, not excitement, something closer to the edge of excitement, where it starts to look like its neighbor. "You need to see this," she said. "That's usually how my worst days start." She didn't laugh. She turned and walked back toward the main excavation shaft, and I followed because that was my job, and because the thing on her face had named itself in my gut before my brain caught up. She was afraid, and Cassie Orrell had not been afraid of anything in 11 weeks. The inner chamber was 30 meters below the surface. Via a reinforced shaft, the team had spent 2 months carving without disturbing the site structure. 4 of her people were already down there when I arrived, gathered around something in the center of the space. The chamber was circular, and the ceiling was high enough that my suit lights didn't reach it. The walls were covered in patterns that the team had been documenting since day 1, geometric, complex, and completely silent to every scanner they'd pointed at them. The thing in the center was new, a column roughly 2 meters tall, made of the same light-drinking material as the walls, and it was changing. Not moving exactly, not the way you'd recognize it if you wrote up a report, but the geometry of the patterns climbing its surface was cycling, slowly, regularly, like breathing. "That wasn't there yesterday," I said. "No," Orrell agreed. "What did you do?" "We removed the floor panel that was concealing it." She paused. "It may have responded to our presence." I opened my mouth, closed it, looked at the 4 people standing close enough to touch the column if they'd reached out, looked at Orrell. "Everyone back," I said. "Now, minimum 10 meters. For once, nobody argued. We were still moving when it happened. There is no good language for what the integration's arrival feels like. I know that because in the years that followed I heard 1,000 attempts. Poetic ones, clinical ones, the breathless journal entries of a generation trying to pin down the most significant thing that had ever happened to them. None of them got it right, including mine. The closest I can manage, imagine there has always been a sound at the edge of your hearing, so constant and so low that you stopped noticing it decades ago. And then it stops. Except that's backwards. It wasn't a sound stopping. It was something arriving that you hadn't known was absent, a new sense opening, not sight or hearing or touch, something prior to those, something that said, here is what you are. The column pulsed once, deep, structural, felt in the bones rather than heard. The patterns on the walls lit up simultaneously, all of them at once. Alien geometry made suddenly luminous, not bright exactly, but present in a way they hadn't been before. And then the light went outward through the stone and through the ceiling and through 30 meters of rock and beyond that, broadcasting at a frequency nothing in human physics could explain, because what it was transmitting wasn't energy in any category we had a name for. It was the integration, and it was putting itself into us. The overlay arrived in my visual field like a door opening in a room I'd thought was a solid wall. It wasn't projected, not on my visor, not on any screen. It was simply there, in the space between what I was looking at and my eyes. Letters, numbers, categories, rendered in a clean geometric typeface that matched nothing in any human design language. I saw my name. I saw numbers beside each of a set of labels I didn't recognize. I saw a designation. I stood there in the middle of an alien chamber, with a column pulsing light behind me, and a stat screen floating in my vision, and I thought, with the profound clarity available only to people who have just been ambushed by the universe, I need to write a report about this. The next 30 minutes were the longest of my professional life. Aurel sat down on the chamber floor and said nothing for 7 minutes. Takeshi, her structural specialist, started laughing and couldn't stop for about 3 of them. Chen, the team's youngest archaeologist, was crying, though she told me later she couldn't have explained why. Markov-born Sergeant Pell, my secondary, came down the shaft with his hand on his sidearm half drawn, and kept looking for something to shoot. "Stand down," I told him. "Where is it? What are we supposed to shoot at?" "Nothing." I didn't look at him. "Holster it." He stared at the overlay in his own vision. "I've got a stat screen." "So do I. What does that mean?" It was the right question, and I didn't have an answer, so I didn't give one. I held on to the shape of my job instead. Asset protection. Situation assessment. Perimeter integrity. The column was still pulsing, slower now, like a broadcast settling into a steady frequency. The walls were still lit. The chamber was still structurally sound. The comms were chaos. Every channel was open and everyone was talking and nobody was listening, because all of them had just had the same thing happen. The expedition's ship, the Kestrel, 40 kilometers up and in holding orbit, was a chorus of voices speaking over each other in 6 languages. Command was calling in. Command's command was calling in. Someone on a planetary relay was broadcasting raw data about neural interface readings going off every chart they had. I cut through it all and reached the Kestrel's captain. "Report," I said. "Sergeant Voss." His voice was level, military to the bone, whatever was happening to his optics. Everyone aboard received the same phenomenon simultaneously. No casualties, no apparent hostile action. The overlay is present and persistent. Can't disable it. The archaeology team? Intact. I believe we triggered it. A beat. You believe you triggered a galaxy-wide event. I believe the architect installation in the inner chamber has been broadcasting for the past 30 to 1 minute, sir. The nature and scope of that broadcast is above my pay grade to assess. Another pause. Then, noted, hold position. This is going out everywhere, Voss. I'm getting relays from the nearest 3 systems. Whatever this is, it's not just Cantor's 4. I'd already known that. The first pulse had felt like it started here and went in all directions at once, outward through the rock and the atmosphere and the void between stars. I'd had no way to articulate it, but I'd felt it the way you feel a door slamming somewhere in a building, not the sound itself, but the air pressure shifting in response. We were the first. That was the only thing I was sure of. I climbed out of the shaft an hour later and sat down in the alien dust with my back against a survey equipment case, and finally, for the first time since the overlay arrived, looked at it properly. The system called itself the Integration. I knew that the way I knew my own name, not because I'd been told, but because the knowing was simply present, delivered with the overlay like an assembly manual included with the hardware. I had 6 attributes. Each carried a number. I read them the way I'd read a personnel file, methodically, because the alternative was panicking and I was a sergeant, and sergeants don't panic where subordinates can see them. Signal 8, frame 7, drive 9, lattice 6, echo 4, flux 8. I stared at those numbers for a while. 22 years of service, the Markov campaign, 4 colonial surveys, a citation for the action at Hilo Station that I still couldn't discuss in a room with civilians. A scar running from my left hip to my lower ribs from the one time I'd been slower than a man with a knife. I'd spent 2 decades building something. Not a career exactly, more like a version of myself I could trust. Reliable, capable, difficult to surprise and harder to stop. The system said I was a 7. Then it gave me a designation. The notification arrived in that clean, cold typeface with no warmth and no apology. Integration, designation assigned. Sentinel. Integration, current actions will determine rank. Integration, monitoring, sentinel. I said it in my head a few times. Sentinel, the word for someone who stands. Guard. 22 years of work. 11 weeks of standing outside a hole in the ground watching alien architecture be poked at by people with doctorates, and the universe's new operating system had looked at me, measured everything I was, and named me for exactly what I'd been doing when it arrived. Correct, as far as it went. It just went shorter than I'd expected. I looked at the architect column through the excavation shaft, still visible from the surface if you leaned right. Still pulsing. Still broadcasting outward through space at a frequency nothing in human physics had a name for. Somewhere out there, right now, people were waking up with overlays they hadn't asked for. Soldiers getting designations that matched their service records. Children getting numbers that reflected potential the system could see and they couldn't yet understand. Politicians inferring their authority scores and not liking the numbers. Doctors finding themselves labelled medic by something that had never met them, had no idea who they were, and had decided anyway. An alien system, built by an intelligence nobody understood, had just finished telling the entire inhabited galaxy who they were. I thought about the scar on my hip, the citation I couldn't discuss, the 3 people who died at Hilo Station because the comms went down at the wrong moment, and I hadn't gotten there fast enough, and I'd carried that weight in a place no personnel file had ever reached. Frame 7. The system hadn't found that. Whatever it was measuring, it wasn't measuring that. Sentinel. Maybe it was right. Maybe it was a beginning and not a verdict. Maybe the designation was a door, not a cage, and what you did after the door opened was still the whole thing, the only thing, the thing that would matter when they wrote whatever history came after a day like this one. Or maybe the alien intelligence that had spent centuries, millennia, waiting under 60 meters of rock on a frontier world nobody cared about, had just seen my whole life and decided I was a 7, and the weight I carried would never register in any category it had a name for. I sat with that for a long time. The Canto's 4 wind found the gap between my helmet collar and my suit seal and deposited grit in it, as it had been doing since they'd arrived, reliable as gravity. Then I stood up, because Pell was looking at me with the face of a man who needed someone to tell him what to do next, and that was also apparently what I was, the person who got up when there was work. "Get the team assembled," I said. "Full inventory, equipment check. I want everyone's medical status confirmed before we send an update to command, and someone pull the exterior sensors. I want to know if the column's signal is still broadcasting or if it's done." "Sergeant." Pell hesitated. "What do we tell command about what happened?" I looked at the overlay one more time. The cool geometric letters, the numbers, the single word that the system had chosen for me. "Tell them," I said, "that we found it, and it found us back." He went. I didn't. I stood there another moment in the alien dust of a frontier world that had just changed its meaning, looking at an overlay I couldn't turn off superimposed over a horizon that looked the same as it had an hour ago and wasn't. The column pulsed again, deep and felt not heard, and the waveform went outward through the ground and the sky and the dark between the stars, patient and inexorable, carrying the news to everyone who hadn't yet received it. The universe, it turned out, wasn't asking. Integration, monitoring. Neither was I. Signal 0, and all stories in the integration era, are copyright 2026 Charlie Foret. All rights reserved. This recording is for personal listening only and may not be reproduced, distributed, or used in any other form without permission. Voices in the recording provided by Speechify. If you'd like to share it, send someone the link. That works fine.